Okay team, so this third question in our Q&A is a great one. It essentially talks about the transfer from strengthening your glutes in the gym or in your front room with the exercises that we've, for instance, got here in the program, and actually getting the crossover. So the question reads, I think I already understand many of the basic strength exercises to do, but wonder if there's a stage I'm missing, locomotion, taking gym-based work and transitioning it into running. So this is something that I see from lots of runners, the fact that they diligently do their exercises, but when it actually comes to running gait, as much as they're perhaps a lot stronger through their glutes if we were to isolate and test than maybe they were 6, 9, 12 months ago, when we actually look at them running, when we start going through some gait analysis work, we can see that they're still displaying the traits that we'd expect to see from a runner who doesn't really use their glutes as they're running. So we're seeing lots of, again, frontal plane motion around the pelvis, so their hips, there's lots of hip drop going on. We see that their knees drift in towards the midline. All those sorts of typical traits as we'd expect to see, again, sometimes a real kind of marked forwards tilt of the pelvis, anterior tilt. The sorts of traits we'd expect to see from a runner who doesn't do a great job of using their glutes. So what can we do to actually get that transfer from getting stronger in the gym into stronger on the run? And technique is a massive, massive part of this. This is why in the third phase of our Glute Kickstart program, we deal with some basic technique work to get you thinking about making sure that you're putting your body into a position where you're better able to actually use those glutes as you're running, and better able to actually switch better able to switch those muscles on and get the most out of those glute muscles as you're running. So there are a few key traits that we quite often see in runners who don't efficiently and effectively use their glutes as they're running. And a big part of this, a lot of the time, actually comes down to our ability to, as runners, kind of run from the hip, if you like. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about getting the separation. If we think about lead leg and trail leg, so as I'm running, naturally, left, right, left, right, left, right. At the hip in particular, I want to see, as I'm leading forwards, at the hip, I'm starting to get a good amount of hip flexion as the other leg is extending out behind me. Now, a lot of the time we can think of that as thinking of it as kind of knee drive, if you like, but really what we want to be looking at is the kind of the angle. If we're looking at a runner from side on, the angle of separation between leading thigh and trailing thigh. As a runner, even if I'm running easily, I want to feel that I'm actually managing to lift my knees in front of me, pick my heel up underneath me, and start to get that drive coming forwards with that leading leg. Because it's, funnily enough, thinking about tackling or tapping into a phenomenon referred to as the crossed extensor reflex. It's our ability to actually drive forwards with the leading leg, which will actually help us switch our glutes on the trailing leg. The quality of the hip flexion that goes on as we drive the leading knee forwards as we're running will actually allow us to get better quality of engagement through the extensor muscles, particularly those glute muscles, in the trailing leg as we're driving that leg off behind us. So kind of slightly counterintuitively, a lot of the time, the cues that we actually go to when trying to get runners using their glutes a little bit more as they're running come from learning to drive the knee forwards rather than consciously thinking about pushing off behind you, rather than consciously thinking of pushing through those glutes. Learning to actually pick your feet up a little bit, pick your knees up a little bit as you run, gets you into a position where you're not going to be quite as much of a, think of it as kind of shuffle runner, if you like, as you perhaps were previously. It's a real trait we see in runners who aren't using their glutes well, is that they tend to run around with a relatively low carriage of the knee, and this is all for the given pace. So I'm not expecting you to be running 10-minute miles looking like Usain Bolt, lifting your knees right up to hip height. That's not appropriate, clearly. But just thinking about lifting the knees just that little bit, that couple of centimetres, that little inch higher than you're used to, can make a real difference in terms of you starting to get that separation between the hips, that lead leg and that trail leg, as you start to cover the ground moving forwards. Runners who run round for the given pace of too low a carriage of the knee, what they end up having to do is not only starting to flick that lower leg out in front of them and start to overstride, but they usually end up starting to overload, and I mentioned this in the previous answer, overload those plantar flexors, particularly those calf muscles of the lower leg, and use them to push themselves off, working harder through the ankle than up at the hip, and start to really start not using those glutes as effectively as they could do. A lot of the time that low carriage of the knee comes hand in hand with more of a forward tilt of the pelvis, so it's anterior tilt of the pelvis and arch of the lower back as you're running. Sometimes that's habitual. Sometimes that's due to tight hip flexors. We're doing plenty of hip mobility work in the program as well as a little bit of focusing on core setting to try and tackle those two aspects. But as soon as you start running around with this big anterior tilt of the pelvis, so if you think about your pelvis as a bowl of water, if we're tipping the water out the front of the bowl excessively, that's going to put those glutes in a real mechanical disadvantage, particularly muscles like glute max in a real mechanical disadvantage, and find it hard as you're running to be actually able to exert the lever arm from those glute muscles, again particularly glute max, to give yourself that strong push forwards. So what we need to do is set the position of the pelvis. That's why in the third stage we're going through exercises like gently drawing the belly button in and engaging those lower abdominals, just to create a little bit of kind of lower abdominal stiffness and a little bit better, hopefully, control of that pelvis from top down, which will then hopefully put you in a position to be able to better start thinking about picking that knee up that little bit more, picking the foot up that little bit more underneath you. And as you start doing that, it gets easier to drive off the back leg, especially when we then start overlaying another one of our technique approaches, which is getting you doing some strides uphill. So up a moderate gradient, doing some strides where we're working 60 to 80 yards at what feels like kind of building up, accelerating up to 5k pace, thinking about picking those feet up, driving those knees forward, it'll allow you to actually start to get working on that separation between the hips, because the loading of those muscles, those glute muscles, and again thinking about glute max in particular, is cyclical. We need to load those muscles by hip flexing before we can actually then start to allow those muscles to contract and push you off as you strike the ground and move through mid stance into terminal stance. We need to work the muscles through range of motion. So hopefully that adds a little bit of insight. Hopefully that helps. Technique is often the missing factor that you allude to in the asking of the question. You can do all the strengthening work you want, but if you're still running in the same old technique, which kind of involves you overloading those calves and not really using your glutes overly effectively, then you're going to get the same old results. Think technique. Technique will often be the key to you getting the most out of those strength exercises. Hope that helps.